Reies Tijerina, a symbol of hope and courage for a great many New Mexicans. Indeed, for Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest. Tijerina, on trial for his life, he was acquitted of the charges against him in November 1968 in a great victory over injustice. Tijerina, a man whose victory offers new hope for the forgotten people of New Mexico. A man who is for them a symbol of the pride of their ancient heritage. What's the story behind Tijerina's victory? Well, the story really begins more than 300 years ago, when the King of Spain granted lands to the settlers of the Kingdom of New Mexico. Some of the lands were granted to individuals, to men who'd served their king especially well. But the vast expanse of the land grants were communal properties, lands held in common by all the colonists, rich and poor, in a given area. These were lands for grazing cattle, lands for planting corn, lands to feed and support a village. For generations, the land was held by the descendants of the Spanish-speaking pioneers. And then, in 1848, the United States defeated Mexico in war and captured for herself Mexico's northern territory. People who had owed their allegiance first to Spain and then to Mexico found themselves governed by yet another power, and they were governed as a conquered people. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, guaranteed the rights of people living in the ceded territory. Included among these rights was a guarantee that the Spanish and Mexican land grants would be honored. But in a short time, most of the individual grantees had lost their property. A few were unable to prove their ownership to the federal commissions that reviewed the claims. But most of the grantees were victims of the high cost of verifying their land grant and of the high land taxes imposed by Anglo-American administrators. And the lands were sold to Anglos for the taxes alone. In the case of the communal lands, the Anglo-Americans couldn't understand a system where no one person could claim exclusive ownership. And so the U.S. government confiscated the communal grants. Vast acreages were either taken over by the government or sold cheaply to Anglo investors. The people in the region of Tierra Amarilla in northern New Mexico were among those whose lands fell into Anglo hands in the years following the Mexican-American War. Today, most of the territory once held under Spanish grants is part of the national forest system. No one is allowed to use this land. And so there's no land for farming, no place a family can graze a cow or raise sheep. So most of the people are poor. So poor, in fact, that family incomes are far below the national average, and many of them must rely on welfare to survive. Into this scene, in 1963, stepped Reies Tijerina, a leader of a political organization now known as the Alianza Federal de los Pueblos Libres, the Federal Alliance of Free Towns. Tijerina was the man of the hour. The first concern of Tijerina and his Alianza Federal was to regain for Tierra Amarilla the land that was rightfully theirs. He would not attempt to regain the individual properties, but only the communal lands of the ancient grant. Lands which could mean a chance for survival for hundreds of his people living in the region. Tijerina sought to bring the land question into the courts, to fight and win the battle for their redemption through legal channels. But for 3 years, the powers of government and most of the people of New Mexico chose to ignore or ridicule his case. Something dramatic was needed. Something which would draw attention to the plight of the people of Tierra Amarilla. And so, Alianza members and their supporters occupied 500,000 acres of land. This territory was the old San Joaquin land grant, now part of Carson National Forest. Here the people set up a government and called it the Pueblo República de San Joaquin. From that time, events began to move rapidly. The Alianza Federal announced a meeting for June 3rd, 1967, and state officials decided that they must take some sort of action. The arrest of Tijerina and other Alianza members was ordered. 11 people were taken into custody. In retaliation, we're told that the government of the República de San Joaquin ordered the citizens' arrest of the district attorney in Tierra Amarilla. Some 20 men apparently were sent to serve the warrant. The result was a so-called raid on the Tierra Amarilla courthouse, an event now famous throughout New Mexico. The courthouse is said to have been taken over by the deputies from San Joaquin, and in the confusion, several people were wounded. No one knows who fired the first shots, or even who was actually involved. But Tierra Amarilla had finally gained attention, the prominence that Tijerina had sought through less violent means, through the courts of law. The region of Tierra Amarilla became the subject of an intensive manhunt as officials sought Tijerina, who was held responsible for the courthouse raid and his supposed accomplices. The people of the area lived in terror as houses were searched, families questioned. The men, including Tijerina, were arrested and jailed. Thousands of New Mexicans rallied behind their champion. And although his name was not allowed on the ballot, Reies Tijerina won widespread support as a third-party candidate for governor of New Mexico while he was awaiting his trial. Mexican Americans applauded as this leader defended himself at this trial, assisted only by court-appointed lawyers. And they cheered when the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Tijerina, and through him all Mexican Americans, had won a great victory for La Raza. It's only a beginning. The Tierra Amarilla land question is yet to be settled, although it now receives national attention. And this is a challenge Tijerina continues to pursue. He will not drop the issue until some land is returned to the people of northern New Mexico. Now, the story of Reies Tijerina is of significance not only to New Mexicans, but to members of La Raza throughout the Southwest. For with Tijerina's victory, Mexican-American political activity comes of age. It's been a long struggle, for in past years, Mexican-Americans had no tradition of political union and little opportunity for participation. To be sure, New Mexico was something of an exception. Beginning with the Anglo-American conquest, some New Mexican Americans had shared in the political activity of that state, if only because they overwhelmingly outnumbered the Anglo-Americans who settled there. Many of the territorial governors of New Mexico were of Mexican descent, and the first governors of the state were Mexican Americans. New Mexico was the only state to send a Spanish-speaking officeholder to Washington, D.C. before World War II. Dionisio Dennis Chavez was elected to the House of Representatives in 1931. 4 years later, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate. And Chavez was returned to his seat in every election until his death in 1962. Now, why were so few Mexican Americans elected to office? Why did so few people involve themselves in politics? Well, there are several reasons behind La Raza's inactivity in politics. First of all, Spanish and then Mexican officials had discouraged individual participation in government, so the people of the borderlands hadn't developed a tradition of political activity. Secondly, after the Mexican-American War, waves of Anglo-Americans entered the conquered borderlands. They brought with them a new system of government and a lively tradition of political activity. And they quickly gained political control of the borderlands. These Anglo politicians and their supporters established patterns of discrimination. In this way, the conquerors eliminated most Mexican Americans from the political scene. Discrimination in education served to disfranchise most Mexican Americans, for it assured that they would be unable to pass the literacy tests required of voters. Anglo politicians used and exploited the disfranchised people of the borderlands, and their inability to vote resulted in a basic failure to learn about the electoral system, about the power of the ballot box. Thus, they developed a sense of frustration, which is still felt today. It's still felt today in spite of the voter registration drives of recent years, which have brought thousands of members of La Raza to the polls.